Hello and welcome to my 517 Follow Friday series. Today, I have the pleasure of chatting with Rachel Swedburg, the Executive Director for CASA. CASA stands for Court Appointed Special Advocates for Children, and they operate in Berry, Eaton, and Ingham County. Rachel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Can we just start out by sharing with the viewers what your background is and how you got involved with CASA?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working in the nonprofit field for almost 10 years. I really started my career when I was living in New York, just before I relocated here to Lansing, working as a kind of first responder at the hospitals for people who had experienced sexual violence, so human trafficking, sexual abuse, a lot of different cases. And honestly, I came to that work because of some of my own personal experience, and I just really wanted a way to give back. I was working a couple other jobs, and so I started doing that. And something with it just stuck with me. And so when we relocated here, I knew that I wanted to stay in the field. So I took some time and connected with our community. I worked at a couple different local domestic violence and sexual abuse agencies locally here over the last few years. And then decided to go back and get my master's because I really wanted to learn more about leadership and how to do leadership well, especially in the nonprofit space. So I got my master's in public administration with the nonprofit emphasis from Western. And that would have been actually right in the middle of the pandemic, so like early 2020. And right around that same time, I started with CASA. Transparently because I wanted something a little bit lighter to do. And they had an open supervisor position that I thought, great, I'll do this, do my master's. And now 5 years later, here I am as the director, finished up my master's and had the opportunity to take on this role. And so my career has really just evolved in the nonprofit sphere since I started almost 10 years ago. But my focus has just always been working with populations who often don't have a voice in systems that are not designed to benefit them. And so that can look like a lot of different things, but that's really my passion. So any work in that line, I'm all about it.
Okay, and I can tell how passionate you are about it too. There are definitely many people in society who just don't, there's no one there for them. So let's kind of dive into more specifically what CASA is, how they support kids in the community, and just really what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, CASA stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate. I'll say it a couple times because it's a mouthful. But really what that means is we are an organization that has a national model as well as a local model. And we actually, very fun news, we have a bill that's been in front of the House and Congress and is actually moving to our governor right now for signature for CASA to make it a law here in our state. But really what it is it's the opportunity for any child who has an open foster care or child welfare case to have an advocate speaking on their behalf, advocating both in the court process and in the community to really make sure that their voice is heard through that process and that their needs are met.
Wow. Okay. So are there age requirements for the kids, or is it just any child in the foster care system?
Good question. No age requirements, any child in the foster care system. And traditionally here in Michigan, that looks like 0 or from birth to 18.
Right.
But sometimes children do opt in to stay longer than 18 if they need additional supports. And unfortunately, we know firsthand that a lot of children, once they hit that 14 and over, are less likely to be adopted. So sometimes we do have cases that will stay on a little bit longer just to help children really thrive as young adults and be set up for success. So any child, the only requirement really to be working with a CASA volunteer is to have an open child welfare case.
Wow. Okay. So then are these kids requesting an advocate, or does the court system appoint an advocate for every child? I feel like there are definitely not enough advocates for kids in the foster care system, right?
Yeah, good question. No, typically these kids are not requesting them. However, I'll put a caveat on that because as we have people get more familiar with us, as we connect with youth who've aged out of the system, more and more people are becoming aware of us. So we do get family members, kids, caseworkers that will reach out to us and say, hey, we'd love to have a CASA on this. However, because of the way CASA is designed, ultimately the only person who has the authority to appoint us is the judge. So CASAs are appointed to a case. We have a court order that gives us this access access to get the information. And we are the only agency that's not a part of the child welfare system that gets this information. So it's a really unique opportunity and role. But I always want to encourage people and not say, oh, you can't ask, right? Because if a kid calls me and says, hey, I'd love a CASA, I'm going to reach out and try and do my best to make sure that we can get someone assigned to that and that a judge would sign off on that. But ultimately, it is the judge's decision. And so
Okay.
it actually looks different in each of the communities we work with. In Berry and Eaton County, we're a little bit smaller, quite a bit smaller actually, and we've been there longer. We've actually just wrapped up 30 years in Berry County. And so the judges refer every single case to us.
Wow.
Every single kid that comes into care has an opportunity for a CASA. There are a few things that sometimes prevent us from being able to take on a case. One of those, probably the largest, is not having enough volunteers. But we've been working really hard to reduce that. Beyond that, sometimes if they're too far out of county, we don't have anyone that can get to them, or if there's a safety concern, we may not be able to take them. But for the most part, every kid that is in the child welfare system in Berry and Eaton County is referred to us. That's my goal to get to for Ingham, and we're slowly growing there. When I started as the supervisor I mentioned, that was mid-2020, we had one judge in Ingham County. We now have 4 of the 5 family court judges. So we're continuing to grow and expand and have the opportunity. On average, I think we're serving about 50% of referrals and probably about 25% of the total children in the child welfare system in Ingham alone. So we have a lot of room to grow, and a lot of that has to do with just continuing to grow our volunteer pools and our ability to have enough volunteers to assign to those kids.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, you're saying every child in the system in Berry and Eaton County has a CASA? Or they,
Yes.
okay. So if we look at Ingham County, where not all of those children do, are there certain types of children that the judges are more likely to say an advocate is needed? Are there just, what kind of criteria do they look for?
That's a really good question. Each judge is a little different, and the guardian ad litems for the children have a lot of input in that process as well. Typically, what I hear the most often is they want us on the hardest cases. So the ones that probably have the most trauma, maybe the child's been moved a couple times, maybe the child's placed out of county, maybe there's some additional factors like domestic violence or substance use that really could use some additional eyes and support. So typically we do prioritize here in Ingham County being on those more challenging cases, but we are slowly growing to being able to just take every child that comes in, because that's ultimately our goal.
Right. So what does advocacy look like? I mean, you've mentioned some trauma situations and, I'm assuming that there are issues that come in with the birth parents and the children, and then you're kind of trying to mingle this with foster parents. So what does advocacy look like? What does the advocate do for the child?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is it's different for every case, but I will give you some examples to
Okay.
really help people better understand. And one thing I always like to say when I'm talking about what CASA advocacy looks like is we know that children are going to be best advocated for if we have a good understanding of where they come from and their family and their culture and the people around them that are supporting them. So our advocacy is focused on the child. They are our main goal and main service provided essentially, but we do focus on getting to know their family, getting to know and advocate for the family, because oftentimes those family barriers are also a barrier for the child.
Yeah.
So that can look like a lot of different things. We actually recently just had a staff person share a story that I think is really powerful about what that advocacy can look like. And it was related more to a family advocacy, which is the family had been living in a homeless shelter because they didn't have housing. They came into care because the housing they were in wasn't adequate and they weren't able to find a new place. So we had them in a shelter. And every single time this volunteer would meet with the kid would say, what I want, because we always ask, what do you want? What are your wishes? We want to tell the judge this. We want to do what we can to support that. The kid, who was, I think, between 10 and 12, so a young child, their want was, I want a house. And that's an adult worry, right? That's not a
Yeah.
child worry. And so this child was constantly saying, I want a house, I want a house. And with some advocacy from the caseworker, from CASA, from other community partners, we were able to find a home for this child, and they moved into it. And the next time the volunteer saw them, they said, well, what do you want now? And their response was something along the lines of, I want to star in Dragon Ball Z movie.
Oh,
And it was just so fun to have the way the volunteer put it. I just thought was so powerful. It was that shifting of from a and needs and focuses to actually being able to just have a child want and
yeah.
a child need. And so I think that's a good way to encapsulate what we do. But it really does spread to any need area for a child or adjacent family. So it could be housing, it could be food assistance, it could be educational assistance. We do a lot of IEP work and support with kids in the schools, having advocacy. If a lot of our kids, unfortunately, have moved schools or haven't always had the educational support needed. And so we oftentimes are doing that advocacy in the school systems. And then within the court, we're advocating first and foremost for whatever that child is saying they want, and then also for what we're seeing as their high needs. So talking about trauma, if we have a child that has a lot of trauma, we may be asking for a trauma assessment or therapeutic interventions. We may be asking for supports at the school. We may be asking for, sometimes it's fun things like they want to be a Dragon Ball Z,
Right.
things like that. And sometimes, it is small, but we can do supports like that too. It may be that we have a kid that's never been to summer camp.
Yeah.
We actually had a really cool opportunity of that where a child had never been to a summer camp, and part of it was because of some of their medical needs and how significant they were. And their advocate was able to find a camp that specialized in their medical needs, and that
Oh,
child was able to go to camp.
love it.
So things like that, really it's about getting to know our kids and getting to know their family and the people supporting them and making sure that those needs are met and that their voice is heard in the process. And so it's different every case. It's challenging, but it's also really rewarding to be able to figure out and help address. I like to call us the glue. We don't provide any specific service other than advocacy, but you can do a lot with that.
Yeah.
And a lot of it has to do with knowing the resources in our community, knowing who to get in touch with, and just helping people, one, be educated, two, have access, and then spreading the word about what they need, whether that's with the court, community, or just partners we may have.
Right. So this sounds like it, for some people, could be a pretty big undertaking, not just as far as going out and connecting these children and these family with resources or maybe looking into options, but just the length of time that you might work with a child. So is there a kind of a average length of time that an advocate might work with a child?
Yes, there is. And I would say our average is pretty accurate. What I tell most people is our goal is for the volunteer to be with this child for the whole time their case is open. And our average case length is between 1 year to 2 years. I usually say about 18 months is a pretty good average. And so when you are able to stay on for their whole case, you're providing stability and support that oftentimes we lose even just within that case. There's a lot of caseworker turnover, attorney turnover. Sometimes they're moving multiple schools or homes. And so by having that stability, we really provide and too. And so that's a big focus for us, is just staying on for a case. Of course, life things happen. And that's part of why we have our setup the way we do. So we have supervisors that are paid staff who support a volunteer for the entire time they're on a case. So they're providing coverage if a volunteer needs time off or needs to step away. They're providing an ear to talk through and listen and process, and really just make sure that that volunteer is supported so that they can do their role well. And so ultimately, that's really the biggest ask that we tell all of our volunteers walking in the door. The second big ask is you have to be able to do the time commitment, and it's not a typical volunteer role. Right off
Right.
the bat, we ask all of our volunteers to do a 40-hour training. It is spread out over 88 weeks. And so it's hybrid. You can do it in person, you can do it remote. We do some online classroom work and some group work. And we usually have about 10 to 20 people in each training session. So you get to work with some peers and learn about all this good, tough stuff together. And that training really does cover everything you need to know for the core advocacy. We do a lot of ongoing training as well, where we offer more specialized things. So if there's specialized medical needs or educational needs, really our volunteers can get to know whatever case they're on and then take additional training to support that as well. And so
Okay.
that's really the two big commitments, being able to do that initial training and then being able to stay on the case for the duration of the case, or at least planning to, right? Because life does
Right.
happen.
Yeah.
And so really from there, they meet with the child once a week. And that can be in the foster home. It could be in a biological home if the child is still with family, could be in a relative. A lot of times, especially in the summer, it's outside meeting at a park, oftentimes at the schools, just getting to see what their environment is like. So ultimately, wherever that child is at, that's where we want to see them. And so that commitment and our agreement with the court is that we'll see that child every week for about an hour.
Okay. So we've got initial training, you covered that. There's ongoing training. We've got, the commitment of, the average of about 18 months, but we want to stick with the child the whole time, going to meet with them for an hour a week. Beyond that, are you looking for lay persons, or are you looking for people who have, certain experience, education? Are there other requirements for somebody to be an advocate?
The only requirement we have is that you have, well, two-part, I should say. You have to be 21 or older.
Okay.
And we do a full background screen. So if there are any real issues related to child welfare, we wouldn't be
Right.
able to take someone on as a volunteer. So we
Okay.
do all of that screening. That's kind of our core requirement. But actually, no, I'm looking for lay people. I'm looking for people that have experience in a wide range of both professional and lived experience, because that's what the kids we're working with are. And we want to be able to pair our volunteers with a kid that's going to be a successful match. A really
Right.
good example of this is we had a kid who had type 1 diabetes, and both he and his mom really didn't know how to care for it. And
Mm.
so we were able to pair them with a medical student who wanted to
Oh,
volunteer. And the impact that that had on the case, and actually that child was able to stay in home because of it. And
wow.
so we're really looking for anyone with relevant expertise, and that's abroad because I think there's so much relevant
Yeah.
expertise when we're talking about kids. We may have a kid who wants to do theater. Are you a theater student? Cool. Let me find you a kid that's interested in theater, and there's going to be a connection there. We also know that there's a disrepresentation of Black children and LGBTQ youth, so we're always looking for advocates in those communities because it's really important that there's representation and understanding for kids.
Right.
And ultimately, we've got kids of every different age and belief, value system, community. And so we want to have volunteers that represent that as well. And that's ultimately what we find is the best pairing, when we can either find a lived or a professional experience that's going to benefit that child. That's what we're looking for.
Okay. Other than looking for more advocates, because we want to help you get this goal of reaching all the kids in Ingham County, what other needs does CASA have beyond advocates?
So we are a local nonprofit, and we do offer all of our advocacy free of charge. So all of the training of the volunteers, the staff to maintain the programming, does cost money. And so any financial support is always appreciated. And so my big focus and mission is really just spreading awareness. So if that's sharing this video, if that's coming to an event, bringing a friend to an event, if that's sharing with a friend that you think would be a great volunteer, even if you're like, nope, that's not me, really just helping people get to know CASA. And my goal is for CASA to be a common word, and people understand what we do and who we are in a nutshell, in the next 5 years in our community. So continuing to grow that is one of the most helpful things anyone can do. And that's really something anybody can do. It's a share on Facebook. It's a word of
Yeah.
mouth share. And interestingly, when we look at our stats for how we're getting volunteers, word of mouth is one of the highest ways that people get connected with us. So it really
Okay.
does have an impact. Media and social media also play into that, of course, but that word of mouth is really, really helpful for helping people connect us as a volunteer. And then,
Okay.
of course, you can always attend our events. We have an annual big fundraiser every May that kind of celebrates the culmination of Child Abuse Awareness Month, which is in April. So we have a lot of opportunities, ways people can get involved. We do have committees as well that community members are always welcome to be a part of and help kind of guide the strategic vision and growth of CASA as we continue to grow.
Okay. Other than your event in May, do you have any other events coming up this summer?
We do. We have a really fun event. It's new. We are partnering with the Fifth Third on Southside, which has been so fun to work with them. They're offering a essentially community day that's themed around CASA. And so we decided to do a book drive. So it's about being more than just a bank, changing a child's story through stories. And so we're going to be collecting gently used new books of all ages. Anyone that might be interested in dropping off some, you can swing by that location of the Fifth Third on Southside, or you could come to our office. But we're also kind of fun going to be having some guest readers at this event. And two of them are actually local representatives. So Representative Hope and Representative Dievendorf are going to be there. I believe one of them's at 11 and one of them's at 2 p.m. And they're going to be reading a story. So if you've got kids and you want to bring them to have them hear a story from one of our representatives, should be really fun. It'll also be a good way to just learn more about CASA. We'll have materials about us there. And that'll be July 26th, which is a Friday. And it's for as long as the bank is open, which I believe is 10 a.m. to 4 p.m.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing all of this information. It's been very educational. I feel like I see a little bit of a future with myself in CASA and kind of using some of my skills there. So I want to learn more about that. I will share all of your contact information in the caption for the video. And then if you're watching and you're interested in learning more about CASA or possibly becoming an advocate and volunteering, please reach out to Rachel. If you're interested in being featured on my Follow Friday series, you can send me an email at katrina@cornerstonelegalplc.com. Thanks for watching.